I don't usually spend my free time reading about traffic control,
Mm.
but, something tells me
Oh, yeah.
this deep dive is going to uncover some pretty fascinating stuff. Road work. Those cones and detours, I mean, we all encounter them, right?
Yeah,
But how do they actually decide what safety measures are needed?
right.
This model seems to take a really structured approach. It's almost scientific.
Yeah, it's true. You might be surprised how much goes into it. This isn't just about randomly placing cones or anything.
Yeah.
The Australian model really takes a very deliberate approach to how they assess and mitigate risk.
Mm-hmm.
And the interesting part is that it starts by acknowledging that risk isn't just about the likelihood of something happening, but it's about the potential consequences too.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I can see how a minor fender bender on a quiet residential street would be treated very differently than a major incident on a busy highway.
Exactly. And the Australian model uses what they call a site risk matrix to capture that distinction.
Right.
This matrix considers factors like the speed limit, the type of road, and how close workers are to traffic to generate an initial risk rating.
So let's say you have a work site on a highway with workers right next to fast-moving traffic.
Yep,
I mean, that's got to score pretty high on the risk matrix, right?
absolutely. And that initial risk rating then dictates the level of planning
Right.
and the types of control measures that need to be implemented to ensure safety. What's interesting here is that a high-risk site doesn't necessarily mean shutting everything down. It's about understanding those specific risks and applying proportionate controls.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Hmm.
I'm guessing things like traffic volume and the mix of vehicles, cars, trucks, buses also play a role.
Yeah, you're spot on. The model delves deeper, considering factors like the volume and composition of traffic.
Mm-hmm.
A steady stream of cars versus a mix of trucks and buses
Right.
presents very different challenges, especially when it comes to things like sight lines and driver reaction times.
Right, like a loaded truck needs a lot more space to maneuver than a small car.
Yeah.
And what about pedestrians and cyclists? I imagine they add another layer of complexity.
Absolutely. The model specifically addresses what it calls vulnerable road users.
Okay.
They're at higher risk in these situations simply because they lack the same level of protection as someone in a vehicle. So their presence automatically increases the potential consequences of an incident.
That's a really important point. So it's not just about protecting workers, it's about ensuring the safety of everyone sharing the road, whether they're in a car, on a bike, or even on foot.
Exactly. And here's where it gets even more interesting. This Australian model doesn't just stop at assessing risk.
Okay.
It goes on to guide the planning and implementation of specific traffic control measures based on that initial risk assessment.
Okay, so it's about connecting that risk rating to real-world actions. What kinds of control measures are we talking about here?
Well, it depends on the specific site and the level of risk.
Right.
It could be things like lane closures, reduced speed limits, signage, temporary traffic signals, or even flaggers directing traffic.
Wow.
But the key is that these measures are not chosen randomly. They're directly informed by that initial risk assessment.
So it's not just about throwing up some cones and hoping for the best. There's a real science behind it.
Yeah.
And this Australian model seems to provide a framework for that process.
Precisely. And what's remarkable is how it links the initial assessment to the traffic management plan,
Okay.
or TMP, which is the blueprint for how traffic will be managed during the work. The Australian model recognizes that risk is dynamic, and a well-crafted TMP should be too.
Now that's intriguing. So the TMP isn't static. It's a living document that adapts to changes in the risk profile.
That's right. The model stresses that even after the initial risk assessment, things can change. Weather conditions, unexpected traffic surges, even the specific tasks being performed on site can all influence the overall risk level.
So it's about anticipating potential changes and having contingency plans.
Exactly. A well-designed TMP should have built-in flexibility. Let's say there's a sudden downpour, which reduces visibility.
Oh, yeah.
The original traffic control plan might call for lane closures to give workers more space, but with reduced visibility,
Right.
drivers might find themselves squeezed too tightly, increasing the risk of an incident.
That's a great point. I'm guessing the TMP would then need to be adjusted on the fly, maybe using flaggers or temporary signals to manage traffic flow more precisely.
Exactly. The key is to have those predetermined responses in place so you're not scrambling when the situation changes. And the Australian model encourages that kind of forward thinking.
This is starting to feel like a real-life game of chess. where you're anticipating your opponent's moves and having a strategy to counter them.
That's a great analogy, and that's why understanding the risk assessment process is so crucial. It's the foundation for everything that follows. It informs the development of the TMP, the selection of control measures,
Uh,
and even the ability to respond effectively to unexpected changes.
wow, I never thought I'd be so captivated by roadwork safety. But this Australian model is really shedding light on a process that most of us probably take for granted.
And that's what makes it so fascinating. We see the orange cones and flashing lights, but we rarely stop to think about the careful planning and decision making that goes into creating those work zones.
It's like peeking behind the curtain and seeing the inner workings of a complex system.
Yeah.
So let's dive into this TMP a bit more. What are some of the key components that are informed by this risk assessment process?
Well, the TMP outlines everything from the layout of the work zone to the specific traffic control measures that will be used.
Hmm.
It also includes things like contingency plans for unexpected events, communication protocols, and even procedures for monitoring and adjusting the plan as needed.
So it's a comprehensive document that covers every aspect of managing traffic through the work zone.
Exactly. And it's all driven by that initial risk assessment. The Australian model emphasizes a proportionate response, where the level of intervention aligns with the assessed risk profile, minimizing disruption while maximizing safety.
That makes a lot of sense. You don't want to over-engineer the solution and create unnecessary delays, but you also can't afford to be too lax and compromise safety.
Exactly. It's a delicate balance, and the Australian model provides that framework for striking that balance effectively.
This is also fascinating. I'm already looking at construction zones with a whole new level of understanding.
That's the goal, to appreciate the thought and expertise that goes into something we encounter every day.
Yeah.
And perhaps to be a little more patient and understanding the next time we find ourselves navigating those orange cones.
Absolutely. So let's talk about some specific examples of how this risk assessment translates into the TMP and the selection of those traffic control measures.
Of course, let's start with a scenario. So let's imagine a scenario where you have road work happening on a bridge.
Okay.
Bridges, by their nature, often have limited space
Right.
and fewer options for diverting traffic.
Right. You can't exactly create a detour through thin air.
Hmm.
So how would the Australian model approach risk assessment in a situation like that?
Well, the limited space and potential for congestion would immediately elevate the risk rating.
Right.
The model would also consider factors like the height of the bridge, the presence of pedestrians or cyclists using designated paths, and the types of vehicles using the bridge, especially if it's a route frequented by large trucks.
Okay, so those constraints really amplify the potential consequences if something goes wrong.
Yeah.
And how would that then translate into the TMP and the choice of control measures?
In this scenario, the TMP might recommend a combination of lane closures,
Hmm.
reduced speed limits,
So-
and potentially even temporary traffic signals to carefully control the flow of vehicles across the bridge. The model might also suggest using variable message signs to alert drivers well in advance of the work zone, giving them time to prepare for potential delays or consider alternate routes.
And I'm guessing those variable message signs could also be used to communicate any real-time changes or hazards, like strong winds that might affect high-profile vehicles crossing the bridge.
Precisely. Remember, a key principle of the Australian model is adaptability. Those signs could even be linked to weather sensors, automatically adjusting the message based on wind speed or visibility.
That's impressive. It really highlights how technology can play a role in enhancing safety in these situations.
Hmm.
But let's flip the script for a moment. What about a scenario where the risk assessment identifies a relatively low-risk site? Maybe some routine maintenance on a quiet residential street? Would the TMP and the control measures be scaled back accordingly?
Absolutely. In that case, the model might determine that simple measures like cones and signs are sufficient to delineate the work area and alert drivers. The TMP might also outline specific procedures for protecting pedestrians, like creating a temporary walkway or using flaggers to ensure safe crossing points.
So it's all about finding that sweet spot, that proportionate response, as you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. The Australian model emphasizes there's no need to over-engineer the solution if the risk level doesn't warrant it. But it also stresses that even in low-risk situations, worker and public safety should never be compromised.
That makes sense. So we've talked about these hypothetical scenarios, but how does this actually play out in the real world? Are there any real-world examples of how this Australian model has been implemented effectively?
There are actually quite a few. One example that comes to mind is a project on a major highway in Sydney, Australia, where they use this model to manage traffic during a complex bridge rehabilitation project.
Okay.
The project involved lane closures, reduced speed limits, and detours, all carefully coordinated and communicated to drivers using variable message signs and a dedicated website with real-time updates.
That sounds pretty extensive. And I'm guessing they had to consider all those factors we've been discussing, like traffic volume, the mix of vehicles, and even potential weather impacts.
Absolutely. And the results were impressive. Despite the complexity of the project, they were able to maintain a relatively smooth flow of traffic and minimize disruption,
Oh.
while also ensuring the safety of workers and drivers.
That's a great example of how this seemingly theoretical model can translate into tangible benefits in the real world. It's like they took this complex set of variables and turned it into a well-choreographed dance of traffic management.
That's a great way to put it. And it speaks to the importance of having a structured framework like the Australian model to guide the process. It's not about guesswork, it's about a systematic approach to assessing risk and applying that assessment to create a safe and efficient work environment.
This has been incredibly insightful. I feel like I'm starting to decode the language of road work, understanding the thought process behind those orange cones and flashing lights.
And hopefully that awareness will translate into a greater appreciation for the work that goes into keeping us all safe while those projects are underway. Because at the end of the day, that's what it's all about, ensuring that everyone gets home safely.
Well said. Now, I know we've been focusing on the Australian model, but are there any other key takeaways or insights from our deep dive that you think are important for our listener to consider?
One thing I'd like to emphasize is that while the specific details of risk assessment and traffic management may vary depending on the location in the project,
Right.
the underlying principles remain the same. It's always about understanding the potential hazards, evaluating the risks, and implementing appropriate control measures to mitigate those risks.
So whether it's the Australian model or a similar framework used in another country, the core concepts are universal.
Exactly. And that's why I encourage our listener, the next time they encounter a work zone, to take a moment to observe the measures that are in place. Think about the potential risks,
Yeah.
the traffic flow, the presence of pedestrians or cyclists. It can be a fascinating exercise in real-world risk assessment.
That's a great suggestion. It's like turning everyday experiences into learning opportunities.
Yeah.
And speaking of learning, are there any resources or further reading you'd recommend for those who want to delve even deeper into this topic?
Absolutely. There are. The Australian Road Safety website has a ton of information.
Perfect.
And you can also find some international guidelines from organizations like the Federal Highway Administration in the U.S.
Great. So many layers to this that I never would have considered before. I'm starting to see those orange cones in a whole new light now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of these deep dives.
Yeah.
We get to peel back those layers and gain a deeper understanding of things we often take for granted.
Yeah. It's like we've been given this X-ray vision to see the intricate workings of a complex system. But it's not just about the technical details, is it?
Right.
It's about the people involved, the workers, the drivers, the pedestrians, and ensuring their safety.
Absolutely. At its core, risk management in road work is about protecting lives. And the Australian model, with its emphasis on a structured, adaptable approach, provides a valuable framework for doing just that.
So let's bring this all together for our listener. If you find yourself driving through a work zone or even just walking or cycling near one, what are some key takeaways you should keep in mind?
The first is to simply be aware. Pay attention to the signage, the speed limits, and any instructions from flaggers or workers. Remember that those measures are there for a reason, to protect you and the people working on the project.
Yeah. It's easy to get frustrated in those situations, especially if there are delays or detours. But taking a moment to understand the risks involved can help us all be more patient and cooperative.
Exactly. And if you're curious, try to observe the control measures they've implemented. Can you identify the factors that might have influenced their choices? Are they using lane closures, temporary traffic signals, or flaggers? Do those measures seem appropriate for the level of risk you perceive?
It's like a real-world puzzle, trying to decipher the logic behind the traffic management plan.
And who knows, maybe you'll even spot some elements of the Australian model in action.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive. I feel like I've gained a whole new level of respect for the people who plan and manage these work zones. It's a complex and challenging task,
Yeah,
but one that's absolutely crucial for keeping our roads safe.
well said.
Yeah,
And for anyone who wants to explore this topic further, like we said, we'll include some links to resources in the show notes.
perfect.
And in the meantime, next time you encounter those orange cones, remember that there's a lot more going on behind the scenes than meets the eye.
Absolutely.
It's a world of careful planning, calculated risks, and ultimately a commitment to ensuring that everyone gets home safely.
Well said. And until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe out there on the roads.